Hi, everyone. Let me just make sure all of our attendees are. All right. Yes, they're all joining. All right. So we're going to start the session. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Forum for Business and Human Rights webinar. Today's session is titled National Action Plans in Africa, Relevance, Potential, and Limitations. My name is Julie Ada. I am an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from Ottawa on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We also recognize that our panelists and audience are joining from many regions across Canada and other parts of the world, each with their own Indigenous lands, and we honor and respect Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. So, a little bit about the Forum for Business and Human Rights. It is Canada's first national research and dialogue network dedicated to advancing business and human rights. I had the pleasure of presenting at their inaugural conference last year around November in Winnipeg, and I'm super excited to be part of today's conversation. Today, our panelists will focus on national action plans in the African context, with more countries adopting NAPs across the continent. They will discuss what these plans can offer um, Africans, where they might fall short, and how they can be complemented by other mechanisms. The goal for today's session is also for them to begin to consider alternative or complementary mechanisms that can contribute to some sort of a smart mix approach to corporate regulation in Africa. So I'll begin by briefly introducing our panelists. First, we have Dr. Caroline Lichuma, who is a postdoc researcher at the Center for Human Rights in Erlangen, Nuremberg. Her current research critically analyzes regulatory developments in business and human rights. She received her PhD in international human rights law from George August University in Germany, her LLM in public international law from New York University, and her LLB from the University of Nairobi. Caroline is a co-rapporteur of the International Law Association's Business and Human Rights Committee, and she co-edits the Business and Human Rights Journal blog. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Lichuma. Next, we have Dr. Oyeniyi Abe, who is an adjunct professor of law at the University of Pacific, California. He is also a research associate at the Center for Comparative Law in Africa at the University of Cape Town. He serves as a legal expert advising the co-chair of the open-ended intergovernmental working group on a legally binding instrument on business and human rights at the United Nations Human Rights Council. He has also authored several articles, book chapters, academic essays on business and human rights, sustainable development, and natural resource management. He's provided consultancy services to international organizations such as the World Bank, the African Union, and advising on various development initiatives and human rights compliance. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Abe. Next, we have Dr. Ibironke Odumosu-Ayanu. She is a professor and associate dean, research and grad studies at the College of Law, University of Saskatchewan. She is a recipient of CHREN grants, and her research has been published in several leading journals and books. She is co-editor of the book titled Contested Consultations in Extractive Industries, Rights, Processes, and Tensions, published by Routledge, and another book published in 2021 titled Indigenous Industry Agreements, Natural Resources, and the Law. Dr. Odumosu-Ayanu has served or is serving on editorial boards of the Business and Human Rights Journal, the Journal of African Law, Law and Society Review, and the African Journal of International Economic Law. She has been a co-chair as well of the American Society of International Law's Midwest Interest Group and a vice president of the Canadian Law and Society Association. She has also received the Provost's College Award for Outstanding Teaching at the University of Saskatchewan. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Odumosu-Ayanu. And last but not the least, of course, we have Dr. Akinwumi Ogunranti. Dr. Dr. Oguranti is an assistant professor and Dean's Eminent Scholar at the Faculty of Law, University of Manitoba. His scholarship focuses on international economic law with emphasis on business and human rights, international investment law, transnational dispute resolution, and conflict of laws. He is a qualified lawyer in Nigeria, in Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. He also serves on the editorial board of the Business and Human Rights Journal and the International Law Association Committee on Business and Human Rights in Canada. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ogunranti. So before we start today's session, I just want to give a brief overview of the order of presentation for today. So essentially, I will ask a few questions to each panelist in a fireside chat manner. Panelists will respond to my questions and to one another. The whole point is to engage in a conversation on this very timely topic. After that, we'll have 20 minutes for a Q&A session with the audience. So please feel free to post all your questions in the Q&A box while listening to the panelists so that we can take them later. This session is recorded and will be posted on the forum's website so that those who are not able to join us today can watch it later. So I believe we're ready to start with our first question. Let me start with you, Dr. Lichuma. Can you briefly walk us through how Business and Human Rights National Action Plans first came about?
Thank you very much, Julie, and good to see all my co-panelists here, as well as all the attendees. Let me quickly say thank you to Akin for organizing and for the Canadian Business and Human Rights Forum for hosting us. So I thought I would answer this question in two parts because national action plans on business and human rights may be a newish thing, but national action plans generally are not so new. So if you think about national action plans, these are strategic policy documents where governments are able to articulate priorities and actions that they're going to adopt in order to implement obligations, whether international, regional, or national obligations and commitments in a particular policy area or topic. Now, national action plans on human rights, for example, at least since 1993, when we had the World Conference on Human Rights, and there was a Vienna Declaration from this conference. This is where the idea of national action plans on human rights actually came from. So since then, many governments have adopted various types of national action plans. Some are on the area of human rights generally, some are on the area of women's rights or peace and security or climate change, you name it. So there's a vast variety of national action plans as policy instruments for various national governments. But then within the context of business and human rights, we of course are familiar with the fact that the UNGPs, which is the key global framework regulating business and human rights internationally, were adopted in 2011. So the UN Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed these UNGPs in 2011. And since then, and actually this year we are celebrating 15 years of the UNGPs. So there's a lot of activity, even with the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, is trying to take stock and measure of how far have we come from 2011. So with the adoption of the UNGPs in 2011, the international community converged on the idea that national action plans can be a part of the toolkit that we use to assess the implementation of the UNGPs, which, remember, are voluntary frameworks, right? So the UNGPs are a voluntary framework. So since then, we've had the UN Human Rights Council, the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, various states, the European Union, for example, civil society groups, even companies themselves acknowledging that national action plans on business and human rights are an important part of the toolkit that can be used to assess the progress towards achievement of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And just to finish up here, I'd like to highlight that the UNGPs were adopted in 2011, and the first National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights worldwide was actually in the UK in 2013. And then the first one in South America, so in Latin America, was in Colombia in 2015. In Asia, Thailand was the first country to adopt a national action plan in 2019. Africa has been a little slow, and I think my co-panelists will get into the details of this, but Kenya was the first country in Africa to adopt a NAP in BHR in 2021. So generally speaking, you can see that the idea of national action plans is not a new idea. At least since 1993, we've had this idea, but progressively from 2011, in the area of business and human rights, we have more and more national action plans on business and human rights.
Super interesting. So what I heard from your answer that stood out to me was the emphasis you placed on the importance of NAPS in actually implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on how you think it's helpful as a toolkit in implementing the UN guiding principles.
Certainly, Julie. So, just to think about like developments around NAP processes in business and human rights. So, for instance, in 2016, the Working Group on Business and Human Rights came up with this guidance on business and human rights. And I think some of my co-panelists will talk about this guidance later on. But in that guidance, they stress the fact that NAPs are not the only tool that are necessary for implementation of the UNGPs, but certainly they are an important means to promote the implementation of the UNGPs. And I think for me, when I think of NAPs, I think of them as being a sort of bridge because the UNGPs are fairly abstract, right? Like they're general voluntary framework that operate on an abstract level. But then NAPs allow us to bridge from this sort of voluntary framework to a concrete national context. So using national action plans on business and human rights, countries are able to now come up with their own practical binding national measures that they commit to within the context of NAP processes. So, in this way, I could argue that NAPs achieve a couple of purposes, and I'll quickly summarize four of them. One, NAPs can help to drive policy coherence and accountability in the different nation states because I think the NAP process is a good time for states to take stock of, gaps in their business and human rights frameworks. What reforms do we need? What inconsistencies are there across legal and policy frameworks in a particular state? And then by kind of taking scope or taking measure of the existing policy framework, NAPS can help show, okay, maybe we need to do XYZ in order to fill any gaps that may have been identified. And then secondly, NAPS help to operationalize the three pillars of the UNGPs in the national context. Remember that the UNGP has the three pillars. So state duty to protect, company duty to respect, and then the duty of both to ensure remedies. So NAPs allow individual countries to actually translate this within their unique context to say, okay, for pillar one, this is what the state is going to do. Or for pillar two, this is the expectation on companies. Or for pillar three, these are some of the ways that remedies can be achieved within this particular national context. I think one of the most important benefits of NAPs in as far as implementation of the UNGPs is concerned is the fact that they are able to foster a multi-stakeholder dialogue, at least in an ideal case, right? Like the development of NAPs, the implementation, the monitoring process, it's not just, one government body doing this. No, the expectation is that the NAP process is going to be a very inclusive process, and this sort of participatory, transparent, and inclusive process means that multiple stakeholders should be brought together in order to come up not only with the NAP in the first instance, but also to monitor continuously how to improve this particular NAP. And I'll end by saying that I think NAPs also play a unique role in sort of promoting national contextualization because business and human rights challenges are not the same across the globe. Different states have different business and human rights challenges. So an app may allow a country to tailor their approach to specific national risks So, for instance, if you come from a country like Kenya, where you have a reliance on sectors like agriculture, you may want to tailor your NAP to the agricultural sector. Or if you come from a country where you have conflict minerals, for example, your NAP could focus on this. So NAPs give an avenue for vernacularization of business and human rights concerns in the national context.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lichuma. So let me just turn to Dr. Abe for the next question. We've just heard Dr. Lichuma give us a wonderful and helpful overview of how NAPs emerged globally. So I'd be super interested in your perspective on how you'd assess their development specifically within African states.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And let me join Dr. Lichuma also in thanking Dr. Ogranti and the Canadian Forum for the kind of invitation. Well, Dr. Lichuma has given us a very broad overview of, NAPs globally, but within the contextualization based on your question and as to how this has, played in Africa and from your introductory statement and concept notes you mentioned the five countries that have adopted National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And I think the critical question is this enough out of 55 African states? But I For me, I think the development of NAP is late, but it is gaining momentum. On the one hand, the question is whether indeed African states actually need NAPs. Progress, of course, is not uniform across the continent. The East, I believe the East African countries, the Horn of Africa, they're doing more advanced initiatives, of course, pioneering work of Kenya and Uganda as well. So I think in responding to that question, I'm going to frame my response around three key points. One is there is a kind of a normative uptake without deep institutionalization. And what do I mean by that? I'm aware that many African states have embraced the language of the UNGPs. UNGP is a buzzword. Whether we relate with the UNGPs as a convenient tool in a policy or regulatory approach, or we genuinely want to incorporate the principles, UNGP principles in our contracts and our conversations, it could be arguable on either side. And to that extent, I think there's a lack of robust implementation frameworks. And this is in part because of most African states struggle with foreign direct investments and integrating business and human rights principles, going pari passu with all these FDI. So they want to attract investors at the same time, they want to turn a blind eye to human rights issues. And again, some African states talk about development. For you to be able to implement the UNGPs or business and human rights principles globally, due diligence, for example, human rights impact assessment, you need guardrails, institutions that will cater for implementation or enforcement mechanisms. Most NAPs, I mean, some NAPs are not, for me, sufficiently developed to even accommodate that. And um, um, I don't know whether to say I'm ashamed to say this, but Nigeria's NAPS, for example, is completely, a weird or bizarre document, right? Where do we even start the conversation from? Even Kenya's NAP is widely regarded as progressive, but it lacks a kind of robust enforcement mechanism. I recently did a study on the five NAPs, and Ghana was the most developed, sophisticated, broadly in terms of stakeholder engagement, plans for implementation, parliamentary approach, parliamentary collaboration. So another issue on this normative uptake is also the lack of political will. There's a conflict between implementing strict human rights regulations and again attracting foreign investment, just like I mentioned. So normative uptake. The second is I think the process has been more impactful than the outcome. Of course, there are 5 African states that have adopted national action plans. There are significant others, close to 10, that are currently developing national baseline assessments. And hopefully, before the end of the year, we would see some others also, 1 or 2 countries that may have adopted a national action plan. And for you to be able to do these, a good number of countries, again, I'll continue to make reference to Ghana, being involved partly in the process. The multi-stakeholder consultations involved in these, drafting apps, bringing together government, civil society, and sometimes affected communities have helped significantly to raise awareness and shape, the discourse or the narrative surrounding in adopting these NAPs. But the question is the outcome. So now we have the NAP. What next? How do we collaborate across countries to ensure that, okay, Kenya was the first to adopt its national action plan. What can we learn from Kenya's experience? How can we improve, solidify Kenya's experience? And again, I see a lack of coordination among this, and I think probably I will talk about these for the purpose of time a little bit later. Lack of interagency coordination. You go to the Ministry of Trade, they tell you we don't do anything about human rights. We are trade here, we facilitate trade. If you want to know human rights, go to the Ministry of Justice or you go to Ministry of Environment. They don't want to hear anything about human rights. So agencies are not talking to each other, I believe African states should learn from each other more. They are doing that, and they should do more of that. And also with the support from international organizations, such as UNDP, Danish, other international organizations that are helping with these. With these developments. I want to conclude by saying that the NAP process in Africa should not be understood as fully operational regulatory tools. They are important norm diffusion instruments. They set the stage, but they do not on their own deliver transformation. And we struggle with treaty implementation and law implementation in Africa, as we all know. And I mean, in other regions, not just to be harsh in Africa, but we are talking about a voluntary, non-binding mechanism. It is helpful, as Dr. Lichuma mentioned, it is helpful, it sets the stage, but they are clearly not operational regulatory tools that will help reshape the conversation around business and human rights in Africa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So my next question goes to Dr. Odumosu-Ayanu and Dr. Ogunranti. So for both of you, thinking about the NAPs that have emerged in some African countries, Dr. Abe mentioned Kenya, Nigeria. So thinking about the NAPs that have emerged in some of these African countries, how do they measure up against key guidance tools like the UN Working Group's guidance document on national action plans and the Danish Institute of Human Rights Toolkit? We can start with you, Dr. Odumosu.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And like my co-panelists, I would like to thank Professor Ogunranti and the Canadian Forum for Business and Human Rights for the invitation to speak at this webinar. Thank you, Akin. I think it's a very important question, but I'll set a bit of context for my response to that question. As Dr. Lichuma noted, guidance tools for human rights action plans are not new outside of the BHR space. Before the UNGPs were conceived in 1993, the Vienna Declaration included a recommendation that states consider drawing up NAPs generally on human rights. And interestingly, at a continental level, Africa then began to adopt human rights action plans, and I believe it was the first continent to have a continental human rights action plan, even though they might not have been bigger documents. There was the Grand Bay Declaration and Plan of Action of 1999, and then the Human Rights Strategy for Africa's Action Plan 2012 to 2026. And then after that, the AU started to then work on a process for Africa Human Rights Action Plan. And some colleagues and I actually did some work looking at that process. And I'll reflect on some of those in my remarks. And in fact, some of the people we interviewed for that work on that continental process flagged business and human rights as an area of concern. And it was as we studied that process that went from 2016 to 2019 that I first then started to view, along with my colleagues, human rights action plans as instruments of human rights socialization towards norm internalization, like along the lines of what international relations scholars will do. And we measured that process against what we called conventional ideals. And it's in that same manner that this question that you have raised has come up in the specific context of business and human rights. We do have some toolkits, one by the UN Working Group, another by the Danish Institute for Human Rights. So they do have those toolkits. But before I look at what those toolkits say and then pass it on to Dr. Ogunroti to continue reflection on this, I also do note that the African Commission in 2023 had issued a resolution on business and human rights in Africa. And even though we're looking at these toolkits that, like on the UN Working Group side, that is more global, and then there's one from the Danish Human Rights Institute, there is more that we could be doing continentally at the African level. And I believe that the African Commission should be leading a lot more of this work. It's gotten into it a little bit, but I believe that it could do a lot more in order to better situate the African context. So in terms of the UN Working Group's guidance, it's an instrument that focuses significantly on the UNGPs, in implementing the UNGPs, and in the national action plans that African states have adopted that Dr. Abe was talking about. There is a lot of reliance on the UNGPs. Like when one goes through them, you would see reflections on each of the three pillars of the UNGPs. And the UN Working Group's document includes a list of 4 essential criteria. So first, starting with the UNGPs and its 3 pillars, start serving as foundation for NAPS. So in order to adopt NAPS based on these toolkits or guidance documents, a state first has to, in a sense, subscribe almost fully to the ideas around the UNGPs, because that's part of the guidance, especially from the UN Working Group. And then one of the things that it does, this UN Working Group's toolkits, that I think is important, is that it emphasizes that context-specific considerations as well as challenges are important. And the Kenyan NAP, the Ugandan NAP, the Ghanaian as well do pay attention to some of these context-specific considerations. There is the need to adopt multi-stakeholder processes and transparency. And as Dr. Abe was saying, the Ghanaian NAP does pay quite some attention to this. They did a lot of work on their national baseline assessment, and they published that. It's publicly available. So these African NAPs, as few as they are, draw on some of the guidance that these instruments provide. And then in terms of another essential criterion that the UN Working Group outlines, there is the issue of regular review and update of the NAPs. Nigeria's NAP, as Dr. Abe noted, we'll keep that aside. But then when one looks at the Kenyan NAP, for example, and the Ugandan NAP, they do provide for periodic reviews. And that's an important factor with these NAPs because they're supposed to, in a way, be instruments that develop over time based on the context, based on what is going on in the countries. I'll start to round this up now so that I can pass it on. And then there's also information in these documents around the process to follow. The Kenyan NAP adopted the UN Working Group's guidance in terms of the process, initiation, assessment, and consultation, and those issues. I'll say a few things about the Danish Institute's toolkit and leave it for Dr. Ogunroti to continue on this. And it's that I read this one as a broader toolkit that expands a bit more on what the UN Working Group was trying to do, so that this toolkit, while it focuses on the UNGPs, it makes some space for other relevant business and human rights framework in a way that the UN Working Group's guidance doesn't really do. It also prioritizes national baseline assessments, which the Ghanaian NAP has followed, Kenya's NAP has followed that as well. And these informed, these national baseline assessments have been useful tools to inform the strategic areas that the NAPs focus on. And then the last thing is that whereas the UN Working Group's document focuses on what it calls a smart mix of voluntary and mandatory approaches, this one adds something to it, and it promotes plans that are smart, right? Pays attention to what some would call smart goals. And the African states, at least the ones that I've been talking about, the Ugandan NAP, the Kenyan NAP, but especially the Ghanaian NAP, do spend some time trying to identify some of these goals that follow this smart approach.
Okay, I guess that leaves me to follow up with Dr. Odumosu's presentation. I think I'd like to first thank our panelists for joining, and then, of course, thank the Canadian Forum for providing the space. But I'm going to be more critical than Dr. Odumosu-Ayanu because she's left, right, she's left some things unsaid, right, and I'm more critical. But I think that she's laid the foundation for me beautifully, right? But when you consider the the United Nations Working Group guidance and the Danish one, conceptually, you can say that the requirements for developing a NAP can be understood procedurally and substantively. You see that there's a procedure for creating the NAPs, and there is a requirement for the substantive content, right? But when you look at the 5 countries that have developed NAPs so far, it's been a hit and miss, right? Procedurally, and I did a research recently on it. Procedurally, the working group and the Danish Institute toolkit says every country should conduct what we call a baseline assessment. Most countries did. Nigeria did not. At least in their document, it did not at least specifically say that they conducted a baseline assessment to determine the areas of focus for the NAP, right? And that's really one of the major procedural drawbacks for some of these NAPs, right? You have state commitment in the NAPs, but what procedure did they take in getting to that particular action point, right? And then another thing I wanted to say is stakeholder mapping, right? You see that the UN Working Group and the Danish toolkit says there must be a stakeholder mapping. None of them, including Ghana. We've sung praises about Ghana, Kenya so far, but none of them conducted a stakeholder mapping before even doing the consultation, right? And Africa is even more peculiar here because we have an informal economy, right, in the region. But without actually knowing which stakeholder to consult, right, it's going to be difficult to set a roadmap, set a strategic plan to address some of the concerns that we have in the continent. And I think I've said enough about the procedural aspect. I think the content of the NAPs, Dr. Odumosu said the Danish and the UNGP, the United Working Group says it must be smart. It's also been a hit and miss. And I'll give Ghana an excellent score on this one because they have a smart national action point. But when you look at countries like Nigeria, right, some countries like maybe to some extent Kenya and even Uganda, most of these NAPs contain declaratory statements that ordinarily you cannot measure, you cannot hold the government accountable, right? Because once a NAP contains a declaratory statement, it then becomes a problem of implementation, right? I said that in one of my research. I said, look, it's important we look at the way they're framing the substance of these NAPs, right? Because if they are not following the working group's guidance, they're not following, or they are to some extent following the Danish toolkit, then he raises question about to what extent these action points can be implemented. I think my time is up because moderator just gave me the heads up. So I'll stop here.
Well, thank you for noticing the raised hand function. I'll do that when we're running out of time with individual panelists. But thank you so much for that. And coming back to you, Dr. Lichuma, so far we've heard from Dr. Odumosu, Dr. Ogorantin, Dr. Abe, and you've mentioned, briefly how NAPs emerged and function in Africa. And I like that you've highlighted specific examples like Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, etc. But I was wondering what lessons from your perspective, if any, can African countries draw from NAP experiences in other regions? For example, Europe, Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere, if any.
Yeah, I mean, so this is really the question, no? At least from my perspective. Because just thinking about what some of my co-panelists have mentioned, it's clear that NAPs are not like, this silver bullet that are going to solve business and human rights issues in Africa. So what does that mean in terms of, and I noted down that Professor Abe actually said, do African countries even need NAPs? Given that this is a webinar that presupposes that we do, I was like, wow, this is a very critical sort of question. But perhaps the question is rightly placed, right? Because if you think about the experiences of NAP processes in other jurisdictions, it shows us a couple of things. So let me start with Europe. So in the EU now, of course, as many of you may be aware, they're actually moving away from NAPs more or less. Now we have sort of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that has been finally finalized after multiple roller coaster moments. And so now you have like a new regional framework on corporate sustainability, which is a binding framework. So you don't have the voluntary framework within the context of NAPs anymore. Now every EU state, I think the final omnibus directive was adopted in March of 2026, so just a few weeks ago. So now EU states have 2 years to transpose this law into their national law. And then from 2029, countries will be required to report on how they've complied with these binding obligations. So the first takeaway is that I think other jurisdictions, particularly the EU context, shows us that NAP processes are just like the beginning, but not the end of the journey, right? So as all the co-panelists have pointed out, unfortunately, the birth defect of NAPs is that they're voluntary. So if they're voluntary, it means that potentially we're just engaging in sort of box ticking, where states can say, oh, hey, we have a NAP, but in reality, nothing changes on the ground. So maybe moving from NAPs to more binding obligations is something that African states, need to actively think about. And I can use the example of Germany to just link the development of NAPs with binding laws. So Germany adopted its first NAP in 2016. Now, in 2017, there was an election in Germany, and the coalition government that came in put a provision in the coalition agreement where they said that, look, we have a national action plan on business and human rights. In 2020, we're going to monitor or evaluate how this national action plan on business and human rights has been implemented since 2016, so 4 years later. And then if less than 50% of companies have not complied with obligations, so voluntary in that sense still, but have not complied with obligations, such as human rights due diligence and so on, we're going to take, and the words that they used in the agreement was that we will take legal action at a national level and advocate for the EU-wide regulation. And then in 2020, the government hired, I think it was Ernst & Young, and they did this evaluation to see how German companies had complied with this provision in the 2016 NAP. Only 13 to 17% of companies had actually executed due diligence, so significantly below the limit that the government had stated in its initial NAP. So based on that, in 2021, the German government passed a due diligence law. So you can see that you can be able to link NAP processes with due diligence laws by having clear monitoring mechanisms and saying, hey, okay, we're going to have a NAP. But in the next 5 years, if we can't see clearly that companies have complied with what was encapsulated in the NAP, then we're going to move on to a more firm framework, such as a due diligence law. Now, let me move on quickly to the Latin American experience. So, like Africa, Latin America is also lagging behind in as far as national action plans on business and human rights are concerned. So officially, about 4 countries have adopted NAP. So Colombia was the first one in 2015. They just updated it in 2020. Chile came up with a national action plan in 2017. Peru followed in 2021, and Argentina followed in 2023, the most recent. Now, I think one thing we can learn from the Latin American countries is that we cannot underestimate the importance of multi-stakeholder processes. So like proper inclusion and participation throughout the NAP process, not only in the national, in carrying out the baseline assessment, but even in the stakeholder mapping. So in Colombia, there was a steering committee. It was composed of many government bodies and then also civil society, so that, they tried to make it a very sort of diverse process from the very beginning. In addition, I think it's important to note that NAP processes have to be backed by political will. And political will means that you need to have support, like top level support, in order for really the NAP process to amount to anything more than mere rhetoric. So for instance, again, in Colombia, the NAP process was carried out through the Office of the President, so the Presidential Advisory Office for Human Rights. And I think this sort of drive coming from the very top, coupled with the multi-stakeholder nature of the process, really made a difference in pushing Colombia to be able to have a NAP. Now, I'll also mention very briefly the Peru example, because Peru, I think I find it an interesting case study because they had quite some difficulties in coming up with a NAP. Initially, the agreement was that the NAP process would be carried out under only one ministry, like one ministry was in charge, as opposed to having it being intergovernmental. One ministry was given the sort of the umbrella power to deal with the NAP process. And this was the Ministry of Justice. So then in this particular context, many of the stakeholders were unhappy. They didn't trust the government to be able to do a good job. And in the end, actually, for the NAP process in Peru to work, the government had to step back, hold a training for a couple of months of multiple stakeholders to prepare them to now take part in the NAP process. And then this changed things up significantly. And then finally, maybe I can say something about the Asian context, because I think the Asian context also shows us the need to have NAPs only as the first step. So only 7 countries in Asia have adopted national action plans on business rights so far. And I think Thailand is a good example because Thailand had a very inclusive process as well. They had a baseline study that was highly praised for, really doing a lot to perhaps capture the nuances of the Thai context. And now Thailand is also leading the way as one of the first Asian countries to contemplate a binding due diligence law. I think the law is in the process of actually being drafted. So you see again from the Asian experience, at least from the Thai experience, that the National Action Plan is not an end all. It's only the beginning of a journey that sometimes means that you have to move from having a voluntary NAP framework to having a more binding framework.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lichuma. I think those comparative examples are super helpful. Just a quick reminder to our audience, please feel free to start posting all your questions in the Q&A box while you're listening to our panelists so that we can take them later. But my next question is for Dr. Odumosu-Ayanu. And the question really speaks to what region or country-specific factors do African countries really need to keep in mind when designing and implementing NAPs?
Thank you very much for that. And I really like this question because surely one size doesn't fit all, and especially in the African context, there is a lot of work that needs to be done with regards to human rights and engagement with business. And these are not issues that, to just follow from what Dr. Lichuma was saying earlier, they're not issues that one can deal with through voluntary mechanisms, so that a NAP cannot be the end goal for addressing some of the bigger concerns that are applicable. Because some of the things, and I'm going to go through a list of them in a minute, they lie at the very heart of the well-being of African peoples. And as I mentioned, I view NAPs, and I've done so for quite a while, or human rights action plans generally, only as instruments of human rights socialization. And I think I mentioned that earlier, and not as the final end of the process. And when one considers that this is being done around issues that concern business, one of the things that I've always argued is that when it comes to business, things are on the side of business, things aren't left to chance, right? You have binding contracts. Everything is binding, everything is cut and dried. And then when it starts to come to the well-being of peoples, especially marginalized peoples, we like to talk about voluntary mechanisms and skirt around issues that should be dealt with binding mechanisms. So I divide this into 2 categories, really. The procedural issues and some of the substantive issues. And when one looks at some of the instruments that have been published over time, we can find some of the substantive issues. But I'll start first with the procedural issues that I think that should be the concern of these NAPs, especially in the African context. The first is that multi-stakeholder engagement. If there is anything, it's very common to ignore the agency and the voices of the most vulnerable people. I do a lot of my work in the natural resource context, and there are lots of people who have suffered from the adverse impacts of human rights abuses in the natural resource context. They have to be a part of whatever is being developed, right? Even if it's a voluntary NAP. So that's the first procedural issue. The second issue is governance and implementation. Right? Take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria has a lot of laws on its books, and one of the challenges is the absence of the implementation of those laws. So no wonder then, as Dr. Ogunroti was mentioning earlier, that there are a lot of declaratory statements in some of these NAPs, right, that one cannot really hold the government to. So there's the issue around governance and implementation of whatever is set up. And then the third point that really needs to go into this, and this is where multi-stakeholder engagement would be relevant again, and that's questions around, on the one hand, a continent that focuses significantly on development issues, and in many cases, rightly so, given the state of what happens with people. And we can go into definitions of development, but that's not the consideration here. And the implications that it has for the attitudes of governments towards human rights protection. So you have that tension, and I believe that it's only through multi-stakeholder engagements in the process of formulating some of these BHR instruments that we can really get to have at least some kind of balance that makes sense for people. And then the final point on the process or the procedural issues is the access to remedy. A lot of things go on, and we find that there isn't effective remedies for the rights holders, for the people that suffer adverse impacts from human rights, from business activities. So I'll list those four: multi-stakeholder engagement, implementation and governance, being able to manage the development and human rights nexus, and then access to remedy. And then very quickly, before I get the raised hand, some of the substantive issues. And when one looks at the NAPs, so for example, the Kenyan NAP includes a list of 5 issues that you drew from a situational analysis. Uganda includes a list of 8 thematic areas. If one goes as far back as that Grand Bay Declaration and Plan of Action that I referenced earlier, a continent-wide instrument from 1999, it includes a list of about 19 or so issues that are relevant to the African continent, and people can look at it when they have the time, and I won't try to list them because of time. But I want to identify 4 of the ones that keep coming back, at least in the BHR context. First is land and natural resources. Africa happens to be a continent that is significantly impacted by land grabbing. Africa is also a continent that is significantly impacted by extractivism. So in terms of the substance of any NAP or any other type of instrument, one needs to pay attention to land and to natural resources. They're key. The second point is environmental protection. There's often this, what I believe to be a false dichotomy between issues of business and environmental protection. I've done some research in the past that suggests that African peoples, not necessarily states now, African peoples do care about environmental protection. And there's some authors now that are beginning to go back to African cosmologies in terms of trying to decipher what it means to try to deal with sustainable development that tries to combine a lot of issues that appear not to be combinable, if there's a word like that, right? So African peoples don't necessarily scoff at environmental protection. So I think that it's a second key issue that has to be a big part of these NAPs or any other types of conversations that we're having. And then the third, I only have 4. The third is labor rights. The third is labor rights. Issues around modern slavery and the treatment of workers is a big deal in many parts of the world, and certainly in the African context, right? And so that has to be a key consideration for NAPs and for whatever types of instruments that governments are developing in the BHR space. And finally, revenue transparency. Revenue transparency is key. I've talked about natural resources and land and those types of issues. People need to know what is going on. So any serious business and human rights initiatives in the African context needs to take revenue transparency seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm learning a lot. I like how you broke it down into the procedural issues, provided us a list, and then substantive issues provided us very helpful list as well. Thank you so much for that. So moving on to our next question, and this goes to both Dr. Ogunranti and Dr. Abe. Briefly, what do you see as the realistic potential of national action plans in Africa, and where do their main limitations lie, especially given, some of the political and economic realities that our other speakers have mentioned in today's session? We could possibly start with Dr. Ogunranti.
Thanks, Julie, and I'll be less critical this time. So I think there is potential for NAPs, And to say this, I think an article that came to my mind a couple of minutes ago is that I think Rivera was talking about the potential of NAPS. I would say to that extent that they provide strategic plans for states. Yes, they're good, right? But they're a means to an end, not an end in themselves, right? And let me say this. In terms of horizontal coherence, I think NAPs are good. What do I mean? In terms of facilitating training, knowledge mobilization, intergovernmental cooperation, I think NAPs are very good, right? It gets us to that starting point, right? That we can then try to go from there. But beyond horizontal coherence, we also have to be thinking about the vertical coherence. What does that mean? It means that in cases where we've had the stakeholder consultation, we've committed to an action plan. How do we implement them, right? And I think that requires a lot of political will, funding, right, from states. So vertical coherence is a challenge for many African states, and I dare say most states, not just in Africa, right? So achieving that vertical coherence, it's a problematic area for NAPS, not just in Africa. It's just that Africa seems to be more affected by this because of the lack of political will. And Dr. Abe talked about intergovernmental cooperation. You see that in most cases, they're lacking, right? So looking at all those factors, they pose some sort of limitations for implementing NAPS in Africa. So the challenge here now and the limitation, so to speak, is translating policy action into tangible results that people can feel on the ground. I'll yield to Dr. Abi to complete this.
Thank you very much, and apologies. I think I was kicked out having internet issues. I believe the question is on the potential NAPS hold on Africa and the limitations, right? I think this is. Dr. Grody has laid the foundation. What more do I need to add? This is really the heart of the debate, right? What realistic potential do NAPS hold in Africa? We need to have that conversation. Are we doing it just because the Western world is doing it? Or are we really doing it because our context, our situation should allow us to do that? Let me begin with the potentials. And just like Dr. Grunley said, policy coordination, right? NAPS ideally should provide a kind of whole of government framework, which is particularly valuable in contexts where governance is fragmented. You don't have governance speaking with one voice. So NAPS, in that sense, NAPS will therefore create a reference point across ministries. And again, I think to the extent that it sets agenda and norm internalization, I think NAPS then become a huge potential for African states. Uganda, and I think it was Dr. Lichuma, I believe, who mentioned earlier that NAPS should be tailored towards context context specific, sectors. If your country is known for oil and gas or agribusiness or land resources, your NAP should focus on that exclusively because obviously different sectors with different challenges and problems. So that NAPS then therefore should be a veritable tool in that regard in terms of norm internalization. I think as an optimist, I think NAPS lays the groundwork for future regulation. We might not have the best of it now, but obviously the conversations will continue. The groundwork for future regulation, it can serve as a stepping stone toward more binding frameworks, including due diligence legislation. We have all the talks about the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, all the countries, having due diligence laws. I think these were based on NAPS and the UNGPs, for example, and the NAPS as well, a critical part of this process. So I think there's huge potentials. I believe it's doable in Africa. In terms of limitation, I'm afraid to say the limitations are substantial. hugely overwhelming the potentials. One, and I think we've had it time and again in the course of this conversation, is the problem of enforceability, implementation and enforceability. There's a seeming lack of enforceability, lack of teeth to enforce the commitment states would make, knowing full well that in fact in some areas, in some states, the states are not even part of the process towards the adoption of NAP. So it becomes really a problem. How will this, become enforceable? And even if the NAPs are avoided, we're not only in Africa, but we have with judicial systems, corruption, lack of political will, and I think it was Dr. Odumosu also mentioned limited access to remedy. We can talk about that for a good number of time. And again, structural power asymmetries. How do we address the deeper issue of economic inequality or the power of multinational corporations, especially evident in transnational litigation, which we now see is one of the tools where victims continue to seek redress. So the limitations are huge, but I believe there is hope. I will end by saying there is hope, and the NAPs have huge potentials for African states.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to direct, just for the sake of time, I'll direct our last question to Dr. Lichuma. We have received a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I want to give us some time to actually unpack questions from the audience. So this final question goes to Dr. Lichuma, and if we have time, Dr. Abe, you can also contribute. So with developments like mandatory human rights due diligence emerging in Europe and similar proposals in Asia, how should African states think about balancing voluntary and mandatory approaches? So something like a smart mix approach to strengthen corporate accountability and human rights protection.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you so much to my co-panelists. I feel like, sometimes it's nice to be in a session where you complement each other with the kind of responses and arguments that you're making. So that's really great. I want to unpack this idea of a smart mix of measures a little bit. So nowhere in the UNGPs does it say smart mix, but if you look at the commentary to Principle 3, there's a statement that says this idea of a smart mix means that states should use a combination of national, international, voluntary, and mandatory measures to foster business respect for human rights. So this is where the smart mix comes from. So that means that, so first, you have the national measures, voluntary measures such as the NAPs, but also mandatory measures such as due diligence laws, and we've all kind of talked about this. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the importance of regional measures and international measures as well, right? And like, I think just picking up on what Professor Dr. Abe mentioned in this final point here, I think business and human rights, we have to acknowledge as business and human rights scholars that sometimes with business and human rights, we treat the symptoms without treating the disease. And that's okay, because there are deeper structural reasons why multinational companies continue to be able to get away violating human rights and the environment, particularly in global south contexts such as Africa. So think about the investment and trade regime, or think about, corporate law regime, or, many other structural sort of reasons. So I'm prefacing basically my response by saying that, okay, these SNAP processes and mandatory human rights due diligence processes can be part of an equation that takes us towards more responsible business conduct, but we need other bigger systemic changes as well. So what are some of the things that African countries could do in this particular context? Beyond having like dedicated mandatory human rights due diligence laws, such as the ones we're seeing in Europe now, I think one avenue could be to have more targeted HRDD legislation. So for instance, you could have laws requiring companies that operate in national stock exchanges to comply with human rights due diligence. So I think in Kenya, they are trying to implement something like this on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. So the Capital Markets Authority wants that if you're going to be a listed company on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, you have to publish a human rights impact assessment, for example. So this more targeted way, as opposed to having a broader framework, could be a more achievable goal in the African context. Alternatively, governments could have sector-specific rules, right? So if you know that in your country, these are the troublesome sectors, mining, forestry, whatever, you could have HRDD rules that are geared to this particular sector. I guess the idea is that sometimes coming up with a sort of broader mandatory human rights due diligence regime might be a daunting task, but starting with more targeted laws targeting certain sectors or certain segments of the state could actually be easier. I think also public procurement policies can help to push, more responsible business conduct. Perhaps governments can use tools like procurement policies where they require suppliers to adhere to certain labor, environmental, human rights standards as a way to kind of pick up the momentum on more responsible business conduct. Or, using rules such as licensing and tax incentives to again encourage companies to be more responsible. In the regional context, I think one of the speakers, Professor Ronke, talked about the African Commission and the fact that they've already put it on the agenda of the AU to try and think about the possibility of a binding instrument in the African context. So we can also think about regional developments, not just a potential binding treaty, but for instance, how can we incorporate the developments in the African continental free trade area rules of origin, for example? How can this help push forward the business and human rights framework? And I can conclude by saying that, internationally, there's the process of coming up with a treaty on business and human rights, which Dr. Abe is a part of as a legal expert. African countries can also support this process because I think it's important that we also have developments happening where African states and stakeholders have a seat at the table, as opposed to having all these developments, major developments in terms of hard business and human rights obligations only coming from Europe and being imposed on the African context. That raises a whole bag of, questions, which perhaps Professor Akin will have to organize a new webinar for us to address.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lichuma. I think this is a good place for us to pause and take questions from the audience. Thank you for providing such thought-provoking answers. We have received a few questions from our audience, and the first question, and anyone from the panel can actually answer this. The first question is, how do you see the impact of the mandatory European Human Rights Due Diligence Law, so CSDDD, on parent companies operating in Africa, as well as the rest of the supply chain?
I can quickly jump in on this to say that so the EU CSDDD applies to, after all the amendments, it applies only to very large European companies or non-European companies that have a significant business within the European context. But it's important to remember that even though it applies only to the largest companies, there's the idea of cascading obligations downwards towards the value chain. So I think for African companies right now, companies that are either subsidiaries or related to European companies in some way, or even companies that are suppliers, so they have a direct or indirect business relationship with the European companies, you can expect that because these big companies are expected to cascade their human rights and environmental due diligence obligations downwards into the supply chain, there will be an expectation that African companies also comply with due diligence obligations. So in a roundabout way, you're brought into the ambit of the EU CSDDD. And that has ramifications because it means that if African companies are unable to comply with human rights and environmental due diligence obligations in a satisfactory way, there's even the option of European companies exiting from, the business relationships with these kind of companies. So the long and short of it is that human rights due diligence as conceptualized by the EU CSDDD is not going to be a EU-only phenomenon. It's going to apply to all companies that have relations with EU companies in one way or another.
Thank you for that. Oh, go ahead.
I quickly add to that. In a simple version, it means either African countries regulate companies within their borders, or they're going to be regulated externally. That's what the impact means. It means that throughout the supply chain, if European countries are going to be reporting to their parent companies, then it means that European subsidiaries that are in Africa are going to be regulated by external laws. So it's either African countries step up or someone will do it for them.
And
Simply put.
just quickly to add to Dr. Again, and I think there's been this argument, in some quarters that the CSDDD could be an attack on sovereignty of states. That why would, a continent, unilaterally impose European standards, which can disregard the regulatory sovereignty of non-EU countries. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. So the next question is, well, this audience member would be interested in knowing your thoughts on the extent to which African countries actually control and own NAPs. And I guess it probably speaks to the sovereignty issue Dr. Abe just mentioned. So the audience member said, it appears that the NAP framework is mainly developed by the West, in brackets, the Danish Institute Toolkit, for example. And they also said that it is something that African countries need to adopt. And no wonder that implementation has become a problem for African countries. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I can say a few words about that, and it's an ongoing critique of the international system generally, right? It's not just the NAPs, it's business and human rights, it's international economic law, it's international law, right? It's even the legal regimes of many African countries and other colonized places, right? There are parts of Africa that still adopt the English common law, right? And it's not just Africa, many parts of the world, the French civil law, right? So it's something that has been going on for hundreds of years for now, right now. And it's one of the reasons why I started my discussion with some of the work that the African continent, it's at a continental level, has been trying to do along these lines, and calling on the African Commission to actually use that body to develop some homegrown processes that would really speak to the experience of the African continent, of African countries, of African peoples. Of course, not to essentialize, like things are different from one place to the next on the continent, but there is a lot that could be done within the continent. And then sometimes there is a lot that is being done as well, but they do not get the same level of traction that the others would get, right? So over time, as I was saying earlier, over time there's been this bid to silence, maybe not in the BHR space specifically, but over time, over the decades and even the centuries now too, there's been this bid to silence the voice of the African, right? So that now many African countries have essentially settled into that framework of thinking, so what's going on globally? What can we adopt, rather than that thinking, what do we have that we can put forward to deal with this problem that we have? So I think I would, to an extent, agree with the person who asked the question that there is a lot that could be done within the continent itself to develop tools that work for the specific problems that or challenges that African countries and people witness in this area.
Thank you for that. So we have another question, and the question is, well, the statement leading to the question is, one of the biggest challenges in getting the UNGPs to actually work is making that third pillar, access to remedy, which I think Dr. Odumosu mentioned in one of our answers. So the third pillar, access to remedy, a reality. So the question is, how can African NAPs tackle this, especially when it comes to human rights abuses by big multinational companies?
I think that NAPs by their design are not meant to tackle it, right? So by their design, they are policy statements, right? But I think one way to initiate that conversation or initiate that regulatory development is a smart mix of measures, right? You see that in most NAPs, except Kenya. Kenya was the only one that said, okay, I'm going to revise my Company Act to include HRDD, which they haven't done anyway, right? But I think one of the ways to do that is to commit to enacting strong legislation on human rights due diligence and then impose civil and criminal sanctions for non-compliance, right? And I think that's one way to actually tackle that problem of access to remedy. And one other way to do so is also think about judicial processes, right? And you have us exporting litigation claims from Africa to other parts of the world, but we are not doing it ourselves. But and this is one, and you may correct me if I'm wrong. I think maybe having a special procedural rule, having a special tribunal or court, maybe that would help in Africa. But I'm open to other suggestions about it.
I have to jump in and say, I don't think we need more courts, more tribunals in Africa. I think for me, it always boils down to, unfortunately, political will. Our governments are complicit in the very problems that the question describes, right? Like, if you think about it, even beyond BHR, why is it that multinational corporations behave well when they're at home in their global north countries, but when they come to the global south, when they come to Africa, they behave not even poorly, they behave in ways that we cannot comprehend? They do that for many reasons, including the fact that our governments let them. Our governments are more interested in attracting foreign investment than they are in protecting human rights and the environment. And until we acknowledge this sort of difficulties surrounding the post colonial African state, I think we're just beating around the bush, right? So for me, this question, like Akin said, it's a question that it's troubling because this is not the point of NAPS, unfortunately. And I would even go as far as saying this is not the point of due diligence laws. I think even with due diligence laws, even very strong due diligence laws, we would still have multinational companies being able to get away with whatever they're getting away with now. Why? Because think about international investment law, for example. Our governments enter into bilateral investment treaties where they give multinational investors so much protection without accompanying obligations. So on the one hand, we allow these companies to come into our country and to do, everything that they do to profit. And then on the other hand, we don't have adequate protection. Unless a number of things change at a systemic level, I think the question of remedy will be one which we'll have webinars about for years and years to come, while the reality on the ground doesn't change. And that is rather pessimistic, but I just don't see how business and human rights framework only can be able to contribute to better remedy for vulnerable right holders. But I will be very happy if one of my co-panelists can give me a more optimistic outlook.
Well, sadly, I don't think I can give you an optimistic outlook, but what I can give you is a controversial statement about, this whole idea about mandatory human rights due diligence. And this is a conversation I've had numerous spaces, whether it's what Africa really need. Just because the EU countries are doing it doesn't mean we should do it. By the way, some laws and some states in Africa have laws that cater for different sectors that, that already provide for a very strict procedural due diligence requirements. Environmental impact assessments in most countries are very strict, robust, and you have to follow. I mean, Kenya is a close example. A significant number of projects are found to be, thrown away by the court just because they didn't comply with environmental impact assessment, the procedures under the EIAs. So mandatory human rights due diligence, it's good, it's great, but will lead, like Dr. Lichuma, like you said, will it lead to proliferation of courts, laws, and institutions? Maybe at ministerial level, departmental level, we could have experts, attending to all these. But to have a standalone or a ministry that caters for these, could knowing full well predilection of African leaders to do some things that we all know. I don't think that will contribute to a solution. I'm sorry, I can't be more optimistic than that.
Thank you so much for that. So moving on to the next question. So the question reads, the speaker spoke about political will and transnational litigation. What is the position of international law in directing states to implement NAPs, specifically African institutions like the African Union? I think for the sake of time, I can ask the other question as well. So the next question is there, should HRDD be placed as part of directors' duties under company laws?
I think I can let me just quickly jump in here. The previous question with regards to African institutions like the African Union, there's a question on the role for litigation, or African judges aware of the BHR landscape. I think I can fuse the two together, and it is based off the conversation I had with the registrar of the African Court a few years ago as to why we do not have jurisprudence on business and human rights from the African Court as we do have with the African Commission. And his response was simply because the court cannot give you what you don't ask for. If cases don't come before the court, explicitly referencing the UNGPs, there's no way the court will on its own bring up that issue. Without going into the details, I believe that the African Union is in a better place position to do something, but as of today, we are still struggling to adopt the draft implementation framework, draft policy on UNGPs. I mean, EU has moved beyond policy framework to mandatory human rights due diligence, CS, triple D. They are not even looking at policy framework. We are still struggling to have the heads of state adopt this policy framework that will also shape the narrative in Africa. We had the Malabo Protocol, which would have been a significant reorganization of corporate accountability in Africa. Again, I mean, we don't have the required signature and ratification. So African Union, I don't think we should place a bet on them. I don't think we should hope on them. They probably have other agenda and again, don't forget, you pay the piper dictates the tune. These international this organization are subject to the whims and caprices of their funders. There's a reason why the Malabo Protocol didn't see the light of the day, because the EU said no, you cannot, because of a particular provision, and there was nothing we could do about. The African Union could do about that. So indeed, I believe our African Union, the African Commission, is doing significantly well with regards to BHR jurisprudence. I hope the African Union can take a cue from that. And I also believe that litigation plays a substantial role. We've seen at the transnational level, at the Ventanta, Opabi, Milo Defense cases in Netherlands, how transnational litigation has shaped the narrative and helped African victims obtain their rights. The question is, maybe at the continental level, can we have the African courts do more in terms of realizing these rights? And hopefully, I think with conversations like these, which the Canadian Forum has set up, will continue to put all these discussions in the front burners.
I'd like to add a few words about the political will question, if I can, Mr. Chair. And this is a bit more optimistic. I know we're beginning to get to the end of our time, and I'd like us to leave on an optimistic note. Personally, we don't have to, others can share other views, of course. But in terms of political will, it's one of the major challenges, and I think Dr. Lichuma put it really well. It's one of the major challenges that we have when it comes to implementation and things of that nature in this area. But I'm a student of the decolonization era of the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. And even when you look at the things that happened in the General Assembly last week around the resolution that was passed that gained a lot of traction, African states and indeed the global south, the third world generally, appears to do better at the international level when they're together. I've heard the language bilateral investment treaties used a few times today already. And there's a reason why we keep going back to those bilateral investment treaties, because of the very first word, bilateral. So when you hive off countries, or when you have countries try to negotiate on their own, with countries that have significant economic power, one starts to face significant challenges. But then when you have a situation where African countries come together, or countries of the third world come together, you tend to often have negotiations or positions that speak better to what these countries are doing. But then eventually you have to get to a point where the state is negotiating with a powerful multinational corporation, and then they go back to that first point that I was just describing. So I think that the African system is a useful system. Essentially, that's where I'm going to. The African Union has not always been successful in some of the things that it's done, but I think that it's a site that we mustn't lose sight of. So site SITE that we mustn't lose SIGHT off, essentially, right? Because it's a place that provides some space, and it's a place that provides a framework for the continent to come together and then try to develop some mechanisms that work for the people of the continent. Because I do agree, NAPs do not exist in a vacuum, but even BHR itself does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within a broader international political economy that we can only begin to scratch the surface of in a conversation like this.
Thank you so much for that. I think we lost Dr. Lichuma, probably connectivity issues. But just finally, to conclude this session, I'd like to give each speaker probably less than a minute to briefly share your concluding thoughts on the topic, and perhaps even answer one of the questions our audience member asked about what should be the way forward. If you could just very briefly speak on that.
Maybe I can start, and then maybe try to answer some of the questions in the Q&A panel. One, should HRDD be placed as part of director's duty or absolutely, right? And you see this advocacy in France, and last year in Canada, or 2 years ago in Canada, right? Advocates are trying to push that directors should have not just obligations to shareholders, but also to stakeholders and the environment, right? So, and in one of my papers, I've argued that this would mean that African countries are at the forefront of corporate reforms, which is great. So, looking forward, I also think that, and Dr. Egusa asked about training judges. Training judges is a good way to do it, right? And that's one of the functions of NAPS, right? That communication between the judiciary and the legislature and the executive, it is key to actually implementing, because in educating judges, then they must take ownership, right, of these state actions. So I think the way forward is a multi-stakeholder approach, right? All state and non-state actors must come together to do something meaningful in order to make sure that NAPs are implemented meaningfully in African countries. I'll stop there.
And I can
Anybody
go
else?
next.
We have 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'll just focus on what should be the way forward. And so I mean, I think there's been a reference to these as to what Africa can do with regards to being partakers in the global discourse. I think we should continue to emphasize a community-centered approach in whatever conversation we have, whether it's the development of NAPs, whether it's regulatory intervention, the free, prior, informed consent, so that the communities are not just participants, but rights holders shaping outcomes. And I'll end with this: the NAPs are neither a failure nor a solution. They are just transitional tools, a stopgap mechanisms for you to have a long-term solution. So their real value lies in how they are used, whether as symbolic commitments or foundations for more robust systems of accountabilities. And the challenge for African states is to move beyond symbolism. Oh, we have this, we've done this, towards a more integrated, enforceable, and context responsive frameworks that would genuinely, my concern, a document that would genuinely rebalance power between corporations, especially multinational corporations and affected communities.
Thank you. Carolyn, we lost you for a second, but we're just sharing briefly concluding thoughts if you have any, and then Dr. Odumosu can speak next.
Okay.
Very briefly.
Very briefly, there's this passage that I came across as I looked at the Danish document that I referenced earlier, and I'll read from it very quickly. It says that stakeholder expectations should be managed on what can be achieved with an app. Developing and implementing an app can be a challenging process, and an app itself is not a quick fix or silver bullet which will immediately resolve all business-related human rights issues in the state. Furthermore, a NAP is an executive or government-led process which results in a range of actions, executive or government-led actions which cannot bind the legislature or the judiciary. And I thought to myself, in conclusion then, that what are those instruments and processes that are binding on the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary? What are those instruments and processes that are binding on businesses and which provide accessible remedial frameworks for rights holders? What are those instruments that are binding on both government and businesses and ensure effective monitoring and implementation? And which instruments and processes account for the economic and the governance situations that African states face, as well as those that account for and respect the agency of African peoples? I think that is the conversation that we need to be having. But to conclude, for me, as long as NAPs are simply one tool and not an end in themselves, they can serve as that instrument of socialization that would get states, businesses, and other stakeholders into the culture of promoting and protecting the rights of rights holders. But that is the extent that I believe that they can go, not beyond that. And there's a lot more to do than to simply socialize.
Thank you. Carolyn, finally?
Thank you very much. I lost you for a few minutes there, but I mean, I think everything has been said at this point. So the only thing I could finish up by saying is that national action plans on business and human rights, they're only part of the story. And in fact, they're the beginning of the story and not the end of the story. And I think as business and human rights practitioners, scholars, enthusiasts, whatever you are, for you or for me or for all of us to consider that the business and human rights agenda is actually having meaningful change, whether through national action plans or mandatory human rights due diligence laws or international treaties and so on, we always have to go back to the people on the ground, the rights holders, the people who are most affected by the, human rights and environmental violations of global North, primarily corporations, right? Until and unless things change in practice for these rights holders, then all of this is mere rhetoric. So maybe that could be the takeaway. How do we refocus our attention not to processes and to procedures that are being done in far-off places, but to every little action that can change the reality of right holders on the ground. Thank you very much, Julie, for that last slide.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. Before we close, I just want to highlight how much this conversation has truly underscored the complexity of advancing business and human rights, especially when it comes to designing tools like national action plans that are both meaningful and context sensitive. We've heard important reflections on both the promise and limitations of NAPs, particularly in the African context, and the need for us to start thinking critically about how global frameworks actually translate into local realities, specifically for Africans. So this has been truly incredible for me and a very insightful discussion. And I want to thank all of our speakers again for your very thoughtful contributions. And we will end our session here. Thank you so much.